The rope creaked as it tightened, dry hemp rasping against the wooden beam. Dust hung in the air like a veil, stirred by boots shifting uneasily around the gallows. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing atop the trapdoor, hands bound, hair tangled, dress torn at the hem. Clara McGraw did not tremble. She stared into the crowd with eyes that carried both defiance and sorrow, as if daring them to look away from what they were about to do. A boy coughed nervously. Somewhere a woman whispered a prayer. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. Clara McGraw, you are found guilty of aiding the enemy. For feeding Comanche raiders in a time of war, you are sentenced to hang. His voice carried the solemnity of a sermon, but none of its mercy. The preacher beside him nodded with grim approval, sweat glistening on his brow beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Clara's lips curved into something between a smile and a wound. I fed children, she said, her voice low yet cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Starving children. Call them raiders if it eases your conscience, but hunger makes no lawbreakers. Only victims. The words rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Some shifted with unease, others hissed in disapproval. A man spat in the dirt. A young girl clutched her mother's skirt, eyes wide as she watched the figure on the scaffold. Clara's life had been marked by loss, and yet loss had never hardened her heart. Her husband, a preacher who once filled the church with gentle hymns, had died 2 winters ago when fever swept through the valley. He had taught her that kindness was the strongest armor against despair, and she had believed him. When the Comanche children appeared at the edge of her cabin, ribs sharp beneath their skin, lips cracked and eyes glazed with hunger, she had not hesitated. She gave them bread, dried beans, and water drawn fresh from the well. She whispered her husband's words as she pressed food into their hands. Mercy is not weakness. But mercy was a dangerous currency on the frontier. Whispers began to circulate. The McGraw widow was a traitor, a fool, a woman who welcomed wolves to her door. Neighbors muttered that her handouts would bring raids, that her sympathy would draw blood to their own thresholds. They named her the bread angel in scorn, mocking her charity as a sickness worse than starvation. Now she stood with the noose around her neck, the town's fear tied in the knot. The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his vest, though he did not need to read it. For this crime, you will hang until dead. His eyes darted away from hers. Even he could not hold the weight of her gaze. Clara inhaled slowly, catching the sense of sweat, dust, and smoke from the blacksmith's forge down the street. These would be her final breaths, and she wanted to carry them fully, stubbornly alive until the trap released. She looked skyward, where a raven wheeled in lazy circles, its wings catching the sun. If mercy is a crime, she said, then let me be guilty. The sheriff dropped his hand. The hangman pulled the lever. The world gasped as the trapdoor swung open. The sound was sharp, final. Her body jerked downward, the rope singing as it bore her weight. For a breathless moment the town stood frozen, caught between relief and horror. A woman fainted. The boy who had coughed earlier screamed and buried his face against his father's side. The preacher muttered a hurried prayer, but even his words trembled. Clara's form swayed gently, her shadow stretching long against the dust. In that silence, guilt seeped into the crowd like smoke through cracks. They had come to witness justice, but what they saw instead was sacrifice. The days that followed did not ease their unease. The gallows remained, looming like a scar at the edge of town. Each time the wind blew, the rope swayed, whispering against the wood, a sound too much like a woman's voice carried faint on the breeze. Some claimed they heard her words again. I fed them because no one else would. Rumors crept in with the traders and drifters who stopped for whiskey and supplies. A dust cloud had been spotted beyond the ridge. Riders, hundreds of them, Comanche warriors moving swift as storm winds. Old Joe at the livery swore he counted near 300, their war paint shining like fire in the sun. The saloon filled with whispers, they know. They're coming. And it's for her. The sheriff slammed his glass down hard enough to crack it. We hanged her to keep them out. Mark me, this isn't about her, it's about them wanting blood. His words carried more bluster than belief, and every man in the room knew it. Windows were shuttered, rifles loaded. Mothers pulled their children close, telling them not to wander from home. Fear walked the streets louder than any bootstep. The preacher thundered from the pulpit, calling the coming storm God's trial upon the wicked. Yet even he avoided the gallows when he passed by, unwilling to look at the beam where Clara's shadow had fallen. At dusk, a boy climbed the water tower and squinted into the distance. He saw dust boiling on the horizon, rising like smoke from 1,000 hooves. He climbed down pale and trembling, stammering words to the nearest ear. Asterisk, they're here. They're coming now. Asterisk. By the time the sun bled into the horizon, the earth itself was shaking. Bottles rattled in the saloon, shutters beat against their frames, and horses whinnied in panic. The first riders appeared on the ridge, painted faces catching the dying light, feathers snapping in the wind. The boy was right. They were many. 300 strong, they crested the hill, a wall of thunder and dust. They paused only for a breath, like a storm gathering its fury, before beginning their descent toward the trembling town below. The wind carried a sound with them, low and rolling, like drums beaten by unseen hands. And in that sound, more than one frightened soul swore they could hear the echo of Claramcraw's voice. Justice had found its riders, and they were coming fast. The dust storm came first, a rolling wall of earth and ash that swallowed the horizon. It howled through the alleys, rattled shutters, and scoured bare skin like sandpaper. Behind it thundered the riders. Hooves hammered the ground until the earth trembled as if split open. Men in the saloon abandoned their cards and whiskey, stumbling to windows where the glass shook in its panes. Mothers clutched their children. The church bell clanged wildly, not from a hand but from the tremor of oncoming force. They arrived in a wave, painted faces streaked with crimson, feathers whipping in the wind, eyes sharp with the fire of justice long denied. 300 Comanche horsemen surrounded the town like a living wall, circling with deliberate slowness, trapping every heart inside a tightening noose. The sheriff barked orders to barricade doors and ready rifles, but his words carried no conviction. The men who heard him loaded guns with trembling hands, their fear louder than the click of steel. A hush fell when the riders halted. At their head sat a man draped in buffalo hide, his face painted black save for 2 white lines streaking downward from his eyes, like tears carved in bone. He raised a hand, and the circling ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than cannon fire. The sheriff stepped forward, sweat shining on his temple, rifle clutched like a talisman. "This town won't fall," he called, his voice cracking at the edges. "You want blood? You'll find we're ready to give as good as we get." His bravado scattered into the dust before it reached the line of riders. The chief answered not with threat but with measured calm, his English rough but clear. "We do not come for your walls. We come for her." His hand lifted toward the gallows, where the rope still swayed like a pendulum against the darkening sky. "The woman who fed our children. The woman you killed." The crowd shifted, unease rippling like water. A few heads lowered in shame, others stiffened in defiance. The preacher stepped out beside the sheriff, clutching a Bible tight enough to whiten his knuckles. "She broke the law of God and man. She aided heathens against her own people." His words tumbled out fast, loud, desperate to fill the silence. The chief's gaze fixed on him, steady and merciless. "She gave bread. Bread is no weapon. Mercy is no betrayal." His horse stamped, the earth answering like a drumbeat. "You hanged her for kindness. Now we hang your justice in return." A murmur ran through the townsfolk, panic rising. The sheriff swore under his breath, casting a glance toward the noose that dangled like a ghost. His bluster faltered, and for the first time, he looked smaller than the badge pinned to his chest. The chief dismounted, moving with the weight of inevitability. Behind him, riders spread out, a wall of flesh and steel cutting off escape. The town was caged. Dust swirled, carrying the smell of horse, sweat, and smoke. The people pressed back against doors and walls, unwilling to speak, unwilling to move. The chief pointed toward the gallows. "Bring the one who killed her." No one moved. The sheriff's jaw worked as if grinding stone. He lifted his rifle half an inch, then lowered it again. His deputies melted into the crowd, unwilling to stand beside him. For a moment, he stood alone. Then the chief's warriors seized him, dragging him forward with a force no man could resist. His hat fell, trampled into the dirt. He shouted, cursed, twisted, but the rope awaited. The irony struck the crowd like a hammer. The very gallows built to silence a woman's compassion now stood ready for the man who condemned it. Some turned their faces away. Others stared, caught between horror and the strange satisfaction of balance. The preacher tried to intervene, his voice high with fear. "You cannot. This is murder." The chief turned on him, words sharp as flint. "Murder. You murdered her with your tongue. You called for the rope. You fed her to death." The preacher faltered, clutching his Bible as if it might shield him. The chief's gaze lingered, then slid away. "Exile will be your rope. You leave this land tonight, never to return." 2 warriors seized the preacher, pulling him from the steps. His protests echoed hollow in the darkening square. The sheriff kicked and cursed as the noose slid over his head. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the town once more. Then the trapdoor creaked. The rope tightened. The crowd flinched as one. Justice had reversed its course. The Comanche did not cheer. They stood solemn, faces carved from stone, their silence carrying more weight than any shout. They had not come for slaughter but for truth, and truth now swayed in the twilight. When it was done, the chief walked to the gallows and placed a single loaf of bread at its base. He bowed his head, murmured words in his own tongue, then turned to the town. "Remember her. She was stronger than all of you." The riders mounted again, their horses stamping, restless for the open plains. With a cry that split the night, they wheeled and rode out, dust swallowing them once more, leaving the town scarred but alive. Morning broke pale and heavy. The gallows still stood, but beneath it lay wildflowers that no one remembered planting. Clara's grave outside town drew quiet visitors that day, their steps soft, their offerings humble, bread, water, a child's small toy. Guilt lingered, sharp and bitter, but so did something else, the memory of mercy. A boy, the same who had screamed on the day of her hanging, knelt and placed a crust of bread at her marker. His small voice whispered, "Thank you." No one heard it but the wind. The town went on, but nothing was the same. The gallows cast a longer shadow, and every creak of rope was a reminder. They had tried to kill kindness, but kindness had returned with riders enough to shake the earth. The story spread beyond the valley, carried on wagon trains and whispered in saloons. Travelers spoke of a widow who fed the starving and a town that learned too late what justice meant. Some dismissed it as legend. Others swore it was truth carved into the bones of the West itself. And somewhere in the telling, Clara's name grew stronger than the sheriff's, stronger than the preacher's sermons, stronger even than the noose that had sought to erase her. It lingered like the echo of hooves across the plains, a reminder that mercy, once given, cannot be buried. The wind carried her story forward, urging those who heard it to ask themselves the only question that mattered. When the hungry come to your door, will you turn them away, or will you feed them and pay the price?